This is not an ordinary religious story, and it is certainly not a dry historical record. This is the story of a world that had gone too far, a civilization slowly losing itself, and a moment when history was forced to change direction to avoid total collapse. Imagine a world where war had become routine, where power was no longer tied to morality, where justice did not belong to what was right but to whoever held the sword. By the end of the 6th century, humanity was living in exactly that moment. The two greatest empires on earth, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sassanid Empire in the east, still stood firmly on the map, but their souls were already decaying. They fought not to protect people, but to protect thrones. Heavy taxation crushed ordinary citizens. Religion was turned into a tool of control. Human beings were no longer seen as lives with dignity, but as assets to be exploited. The world did not lack strength. What it lacked was meaning. At the edge of the civilized world, in a place historians barely bothered to mention, the Arabian Peninsula existed as a land barren not only in geography but in moral direction. The society of jahiliyyah was ruled by tribes, blood repaid with blood, and honor defended through violence. Every tribe had its own god. Every god served the interests of its group. There was no shared law, no universal value. The weak were born to be trampled. Women were treated as burdens. Infants, especially girls, could be buried alive simply to protect a father's so-called honor. The most frightening thing was not the cruelty. It was that cruelty had become normal. When evil becomes familiar, the history often reaches a turning point. And in that deepest darkness, the first signs of a great intervention began to appear. The Year of the Elephant was not just a strange military episode, it was a warning. When Abraha marched toward the Kaaba with a powerful army supported by war elephants, no tribe dared to resist. There was no strategy, no defense. And yet, the Kaaba remained standing, not because of human effort, not because of weapons, but through a force beyond the logic of power. History spoke in its own way. There are things that do not belong under human control. And shortly after that, an orphan was born, not a king, not a conqueror, not an heir to a throne. Muhammad ibn Abdullah entered a violent society, yet grew up without being consumed by its violence. He witnessed the decay of the system, but never compromised with it. He lived among people, traded with them, worked as they did, yet never lost his integrity. People trusted him even when they did not fully understand him. They called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. But the most important thing was not what he did. It was what troubled him. In a world filled with the noise of idols, disputes, and bloodshed, Muhammad sought silence. Not to escape society, but to search for truth. In the cave of Hira, the questions grew heavier. If what this society believes is right, why is it so cruel? If God exists, why has justice disappeared? Then, on a destined night, the silence was shattered. The first command was not fight, and it was not rule. It was read. A command given to a man who could not read. A command that granted no power, only responsibility. Muhammad trembled, overwhelmed with fear. And this was not a moment of glory. It was the moment a man realized his life would never belong to himself again. Islam did not begin with an army. It began with a heart carrying the weight of humanity. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. If you have stayed with us this far, stay a little longer, because what comes next does not only reshape history, it forces us to rethink power, morality, and the true meaning of civilization. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained and support us in bringing more thoughtful and meaningful content in the future. And now, the real journey of Islam begins. Before a message can change history, that history must be placed in the hands of someone capable of carrying it. And that person is not shaped by power, but by experience. Muhammad ibn Abdullah grew up in a society where survival was always tied to injustice. Yet instead of becoming hardened by it, he learned to observe. From a young age, he worked, herding sheep across dry hills, then traveling with merchant caravans across the desert. Those journeys taught him more than trade. They taught him how to read people. He saw greed hidden in dishonest deals. He saw fear behind the pride of the wealthy. He saw the quiet resignation of the poor who had no voice. And yet, he never allowed himself to be pulled into that cycle. In a society where words were twisted for advantage, he kept his word. Where strength was used to dominate, he chose fairness. His integrity was not a loud moral declaration, but a consistent way of living. That is why people turned to him when they needed someone they could trust. And when they needed someone to stand for truth, they called his name. The title Al-Amin was not a reward. It was the natural result of a life lived honestly. It was in this context that Khadijah became a turning point. She did not see in Muhammad only a capable merchant, but a rare character. Their marriage was not built on power or ambition, but on respect and partnership. In a society where women were often pushed aside, Khadijah became a pillar of strength, someone who understood that Muhammad's value was not in what he owned, but in who he was becoming. Their home was quiet, unremarkable from the outside, yet it nurtured a soul increasingly burdened by profound questions. The more Muhammad lived among people, the more he felt he did not belong to the system they upheld. He found no fulfillment in polytheistic rituals, no answers in tribal traditions. In the stillness of night, when Makkah slept, he withdrew from the crowd into solitude. The cave of Hira was not an escape from reality, but a place where he faced it without illusion. There were no idols to cling to, no community to rely on, only a human being and questions far beyond ordinary reason. This preparation did not happen in a single day, nor was it announced to anyone. It unfolded quietly through strange dreams, unnamed sensations, and the growing feeling that life was leading him towards something far greater than himself. There was no explanation yet, no clear command, only an invisible pressure weighing heavier on his mind. And when the moment finally arrived, it did not look like triumph. The encounter with the angel was not a gentle mystical experience, and it was a shock that shook Muhammad to his core. The command he received was not an invitation, but a burden. Not choose, but carry. His fear was not weakness. It was the honest reaction of someone who understood that life as he knew it was over. When he returned home trembling, it was Khadijah who recognized what he could not yet name. She did not doubt him, question him, or demand proof. She knew that a man who had lived his entire life with integrity could not suddenly become a liar. Her faith was not just personal support. It became the first spiritual foundation of a mission that would shake the world. It is essential to understand that Muhammad did not step into the role of a prophet seeking power. He stepped into it as someone entrusted with responsibility he could not refuse. From that moment, Islam did not appear as a rebellious movement, but as a moral burden. It demanded patience, endurance, and above all, absolute honesty with oneself. Because he was prepared through life, through experience, through loneliness, and through deeply human fear, Muhammad was able to carry a message meant for all of humanity. Not because he rose above people, but because he understood them completely. And from here, Islam entered a new stage, where belief no longer lived only in one heart, but began to confront an entire society. When a message begins to spread, the first reaction of threatened systems is always repression. Islam was no exception. What made this period unique was not the level of violence, but how the earliest believers faced it. Those who embraced Islam were not promised power nor protected by political structures, and they chose faith individually and paid for that choice with their own safety. When the declaration that God is one echoed through a society built on idols, it was not just a religious statement. It challenged the entire existing order. Tribal authority was threatened. Economic interests tied to idol worship were shaken. Social hierarchies based on bloodline and wealth began to crack. Makkah responded swiftly and brutally. First came mockery, then isolation, then open violence. The most vulnerable were targeted first because no one stood to defend them. Bodies tortured under the desert sun carried more than pain. They carried a question that challenged society itself. What makes a person endure this and refuse to turn away? The answer was that Islam gave them more than belief. It gave them value. For the first time, and those considered insignificant were told they had dignity, that they were not born to be crushed, that before God no one stood above another. The oppression continued and intensified. Economic boycotts turned entire families into prisoners within their own homeland. Children cried from hunger in streets that had never known compassion. What the oppressors failed to understand was this: when a community is bound by meaning and belief, violence does not easily break it. Instead, it exposes the moral emptiness of the system clinging to power. As doors closed in Makkah, Islam did not survive by direct confrontation. It chose a harder but more enduring path: transformation through relocation. The hijrah was not the escape of the weak. It was a morally strategic decision, and it recognized that a message cannot grow if it is suffocated at its roots, and that sometimes preserving truth requires leaving behind what is most familiar. Medina was not just a destination, it was a historical opportunity. Here, Islam faced a challenge beyond personal belief: how to organize a society. Migrants arrived carrying memories of persecution and loss. The local population brought their own traditions, resources, and social structures. Without a principle beyond tribal loyalty, conflict would have been inevitable. In this setting, Islam revealed its deepest nature. The Constitution of Medina was not written as an idealistic slogan, but as a practical framework for coexistence. It did not erase differences, but set limits on conflict. It did not force belief, but demanded shared responsibility. For the first time in the region's history, communities of different faiths were recognized as legitimate members of society, with clearly defined rights and obligations. Justice no longer depended on lineage, but on principle. Alongside this came another quiet revolution: brotherhood beyond blood. The migrants who had left everything behind were welcomed not as burdens, but as family. Sharing was not charity, but a redistribution of social responsibility. This shattered the logic of hoarded wealth deeply rooted in tribal society. Wealth was no longer a tool of dominance, but a means to serve the community. It was in Medina that Islam crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer just a moral call among a small group. It became a functioning social model, where belief was tested through action, and values revealed themselves in how people treated one another. Those once expelled for their faith now built a society where faith no longer needed to hide. This phase laid the foundation for everything that followed. Not through military victories, but through the ability to turn wounded individuals into a disciplined, responsible, and forward-looking community. From this point on, Islam did not exist merely to be believed. It existed to be lived, tested, and spread through social life itself. And that made what came next irreversible. When a community takes shape, the surrounding world must react. As Islam moved from persecution to governance, its greatest challenge was no longer belief, but how belief confronted power and violence. Conflict did not arise because Muslims sought war. It arose because the old order refused to accept the existence of a new one. The first confrontations were not simply clashes of armies, but collisions between two visions of humanity. One believed value was determined by lineage, wealth, and strength. The other declared value lay in responsibility, discipline, and honesty before God. Muslims knew they lacked advantage. They were outnumbered, poorly equipped, and inexperienced. What they possessed was unity and a non-negotiable principle. Fighting was not for revenge, but for the right of the community to exist. That principle defined everything. When victory came, it was not treated as proof of superiority, but as a new test. Could discipline be maintained when weakness was gone? The answer was not always yes. At times, success bred carelessness. When discipline faltered, the consequences followed immediately. Battlefield mistakes brought not only casualties, but harsh lessons. Faith did not exempt anyone from responsibility. Good intentions could not replace adherence to principles. Failure was not hidden or excused. It was confronted directly as part of collective growth. In those moments, the moral character of Islam became clearer. When pushed into defense, the community rejected blind retaliation. They learned to use intelligence over brute force. Creative solutions, unheard of in Arabian warfare, were developed and implemented with the participation of the entire society. Victory, when achieved, came not because enemies weakened, but because the community learned to act as one body. The greatest test, however, did not come on the battlefield. When fighting paused for negotiation, the terms appeared painful and humiliating to many. On the surface, they looked like unacceptable concessions. Beneath that surface lay a profound moral strategy. Islam restrained its own strength to create space for peace. And in that space, the message spread faster than any army. People listened not out of fear, but curiosity. They saw a community willing to accept short-term loss to protect long-term principles. Power was redefined, not as the ability to dominate others, but as the ability to restrain oneself. When the final decisive moment arrived, the Muslim community faced the temptation history knows well: revenge. Years of violence, exile, and loss could have justified bloodshed. Yet what unfolded defied the instinct of power. When the gates of the once hostile city opened, there was no massacre, no revenge lists. Few former enemies were given a chance to begin again. Symbols of oppression were removed, but lives were preserved. That moment changed more than the fate of a city. It sent a timeless message. True victory lies not in subduing others, but in ending cycles of hatred. Islam demonstrated that moral strength can achieve what violence never can. The final messages of this period did not focus on war or expansion. They centered on human value. Equality was no longer abstract. It became a living standard. Life, property, and honor were declared inviolable. Women were no longer property, but a moral trust. Power was not sanctified, but bound by responsibility. This part of Islamic history does not aim to glorify victories. It seeks to answer a deeper question. What happens when an oppressed community gains power? The answer is not flawless, but clear enough to serve as a benchmark. Islam does not promise humans will not fail. It offers a moral framework for returning when failure occurs. That framework would soon face its greatest test as Islam moved from a community guided by a prophet to a world where power rested entirely in human hands. When the leader departed this world, what remained was not only memory, but the question every community faces. Who will carry this responsibility and how? With the passing of the Prophet, Islam entered its most difficult phase. Not because of external enemies, but because for the first time, authority belonged entirely to humans. The early years were a struggle to prevent fragmentation. Without prophetic presence, loyalty was tested. Tribes withdrew their allegiance. False claimants emerged. The fragile order risked collapse from within. Yet in that moment, something crucial was affirmed. Islam did not depend on a single individual, but on values. Leadership was chosen not by bloodline, but by consensus and accountability. Power was understood as duty, not privilege. As stability returned, an unprecedented phenomenon unfolded. A small desert community stepped onto the world stage. Empires that had ruled for centuries collapsed with shocking speed. What drew many lands toward Islam was not military force alone. It was liberation from long-standing exploitation. Taxes were lighter, laws clearer. Faith was not imposed. For many, the change felt like justice rather than invasion. History, however, never follows a perfect line. As territory expanded, wealth poured in, and power became familiar, fractures appeared. The early simplicity gave way to political ambition. Unresolved tensions ignited conflict. Innocent blood was spilled not by foreign enemies, but by hands of those sharing the same faith. These tragedies were not merely historical events. They became permanent warnings of the cost of power detached from ethics. Islam entered its imperial era. Lands stretched from the Atlantic to Central Asia. Yet expansion did not always bring justice. When ethnic identity outweighed moral principle, the original universal spirit eroded. Marginalized communities grew resentful. Discontent simmered, waiting to erupt. Still, even in this era, Islam was not consumed by darkness. Short-lived leaders left lasting marks, proving power could heal as well as dominate. Gradually, focus shifted from conquest to knowledge. As major cities became centers of learning, another revolution unfolded, quieter but more enduring than any military campaign. Knowledge was gathered, preserved, and expanded. Science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy flourished not to serve blind belief, but to understand the world God created. Islam did not merely rule land, it guided thought. Even when those centers fell to brutal violence, their spirit survived. Books could burn, cities could be destroyed, but ideas once planted in history could not be erased. Islam continued to move, adapt, and re-emerge in new lands and forms. As power passed to different peoples, a new chapter opened. Islam no longer belonged to one ethnicity, it became global. In Europe, it offered alternatives to rigid feudal systems. In Africa and Asia, it blended with local cultures, transforming rather than erasing them. The communities embraced Islam not solely through force, but because they saw a system they could live with. The height of this era was not military victory, but the ability to connect distant lands under a shared legal and moral framework. People traveled from west to east, north to south, guided by common values of justice, responsibility, and dignity. Few civilizations ever achieved that. And then, like all empires, that age passed. But Islam did not end with the decline of any dynasty. Its core was never the throne. It was the question it asked every generation. Who will power serve, and what will life be lived for? That question keeps this story alive, echoing into the present and the future. The greatest lesson of this story is not for nations or empires alone, but for individuals. Each of us holds power in some form. It's power within families, workplaces, words, and behavior toward others. The question Islamic history asks us today is simple. When we have a choice, what do we choose? Justice or convenience? Principle or short-term gain? Building or destroying? Applied to modern life, this lesson begins with small actions. Honesty when no one is watching. Respect for those weaker than us. Patience and discipline in times of ease, not only hardship. Above all, refusing to measure human worth by status, wealth, or origin, but by character and action. That is how values that once changed history can continue to live today. If these historical stories do more than explain the past, if they help you reflect on yourself and the world around you, join the Prophetic History Explained community to explore deeper knowledge about prophetic history, sharing the turning points of human civilization and timeless lessons still relevant to modern life. And do not forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us in creating more thoughtful, meaningful, and high-quality content in future videos.